In a world that screams for your attention, there's a place that invites you to peace. You don't need a building. You don't need a choir. You just need to turn your heart to Air One.
Air One. Songs that heal. Lyrics that pray for you when you don't have the words.
From Lauren Daigle to Elevation Worship and more.
This isn't just radio. It's worship for the everyday.
Escape the noise and worship now.
Download the Air One app. Ask your smart speaker to play Air One or visit air1.com. Air One. Worship now.
Each week on Culinary Confidential, Christina Cates, a seasoned foodie who has worked at some of New York City's top restaurants, will share her passion for the culinary world. Whether you're a professional chef, a restaurant enthusiast, or a lover of good food, Christina dives into the heart of hospitality, exploring the trends, triumphs, and challenges facing the food service profession. And you won't want to miss her chats with some of the most interesting and influential industry voices. And now, please take your seat at the table as Culinary Confidential with Christina Cates starts now, exclusively on AM 970, The Answer.
Good evening and welcome to the show. This show is produced in association with Lucas A. Ferrara and Shake It Off Live. Tonight marks the beginning of a very special month here on Culinary Confidential. All throughout July, we are celebrating Americana, not just America in the political sense, not America in the superficial sense, but America through the lens of food, beverage, hospitality, culture, history, and the people who have shaped this nation one table at a time. Because this year marks something monumental, the 250th anniversary of the United States of America, 250 years. And when you really stop and think about that number, it's staggering. For 250 years, America has evolved through revolution, immigration, reinvention, hardship, triumph, industry, agriculture, war, celebration, entrepreneurship, and culture. And through every era, food has quietly documented the entire story. Food tells the truth about a country. It tells us who had abundance and who struggled, who arrived here carrying recipes from another homeland, who gathered around tables during times of uncertainty, what we celebrated, what we rationed, what we drank, and what we preserved, and what we passed down. And tonight's episode is really the perfect way to begin this series because we are taking a journey through America's culinary identity from 1776 to 2026, a true culinary time capsule. Joining me tonight is culinary food historian and chef Jay Reifel, and together we're exploring how America evolved through food and beverage over the course of nearly 2.5 centuries. And honestly, when you start peeling back the layers, American food history is far more fascinating than people realize. Because America doesn't have one culinary identity. America is the culinary melting pot. Native American food traditions, European influence, African influence, immigrant influence, regional influence, Southern smokehouses, New York delis, Midwestern diners, Creole cooking, cowboy cooking, industrial food systems, luxury dining, Prohibition-era cocktails, roadside motels and church cookbooks, victory gardens, fast food, fine dining, food television, backyard grilling culture. The story of America can almost be told entirely through what was happening in kitchens and around tables. And throughout this month on Culinary Confidential, we're diving into all of it. Tonight with Jay Reifel, we explore America's culinary timeline from the Revolutionary era to modern food culture. Next week, I'll be joined by Chef Robert Irvine for a deeply meaningful conversation surrounding veterans, leadership, resilience, and food insecurity among military families through the work of the Robert Irvine Foundation. We'll also dive into America's whiskey culture and prohibition at the end of the month with my favorite whiskey connoisseur, Noah Rothbaum, because no conversation about Americana would be complete without discussing one of the wildest eras in American beverage history. And then we're bringing on Kent Rowlands, a real American cowboy, to explore cowboy culture, open fire cooking, ranch life, and one of the most romanticized yet authentic food traditions this country has ever known. And what I love most about this series is that every conversation connects back to one central idea. America is a country constantly reinventing itself, and nowhere is that more visible than in food and hospitality. You can trace the rise of industry through diners. You can trace immigration through neighborhood restaurants. You can trace economic booms and hardships through what people cooked at home. You can trace cultural movements through cocktails, restaurants, barbecue traditions, supper clubs, and regional cuisine. Even something as simple as a family recipe becomes historical documentation. And food doesn't just preserve history, it preserves emotion. Think about it. Certain smells immediately transport you somewhere. A pie recipe becomes your grandmother. A diner becomes your childhood. A prohibition cocktail becomes rebellion. A steakhouse becomes celebration. Food is memory, identity, and community. And right now, in a world that feels increasingly disconnected, rushed, divided, and digital, I actually think conversations like this matter more than ever. Because sitting around a table is one of the few things people still universally understand. Hospitality, connection, and tradition still matters, at least in my house. And regardless of political affiliation, background, or beliefs, I think this month is really about appreciating what an extraordinary place America is. It's imperfect, it's evolving, complicated, innovative, and endlessly influential, especially when it comes to food and beverage culture. Because whether we're talking about bourbon, barbecue, delis, fine dining, farming, or cowboy cooking, America has shaped the global culinary conversation in ways people often underestimate. So tonight we begin at the beginning. A culinary time capsule, 1776 to 2026. What did early Americans eat? How did war shape our food systems? How did immigration redefine the American table? When did restaurants become cultural landmarks? How did prohibition change drinking forever? And what does American food culture say about who we are today? Jay Reifel, welcome back to the show. I love when I have a familiar face back on. And when Ryan Pagano here suggested that we do a full month of Americana for the 250th anniversary, I said to myself, I have the perfect guy. If we're going to talk food history, we need to have Jay back on the show. So tell me, what have you been up to in the last year since you've been on Culinary Confidential?
I have been extraordinarily busy, mostly with good things.
That's great.
Apart from all the culinary history that I do, I have been working on a more regular person, fun, smart person cookbook that I have high hopes for. Let's just say that.
Oh, that's very exciting. And when that comes out, which it will, we'll have you back on for a third time because we're going to do season 3 of the show.
Excellent.
Hot off the press. All right. You are here tonight to talk about the Culinary Time Capsule, right? 1776 to 2026. So I guess we should start at the beginning, right? The birth of American cuisine? What do you
Absolutely.
say? The
Let's
very
do it.
beginning? Okay, when people think of 1776, they think politics and war. But what did daily life actually taste like in America at that time?
So 1776 is already pretty far into the birth of American cuisine. We're talking about the Revolutionary War. It's long, long past the early settlers. So at this point, the technology of American food has actually come an enormous distance, right?
Okay.
So now there actually is, because remember, we came out of a period of real starvation, right?
Yeah.
Early America was just extremely difficult for the settlers. So food around 1776 is in this period of transition from really English food to American food. We had an issue in early America where the first settlers were English people with a real problem of what we call geographical illiteracy.
Okay.
They didn't understand what foods grew in America. They're very good at growing wheat, and they're very good at raising sheep, but they didn't know much about corn. They certainly didn't understand the very sophisticated indigenous agricultural practices.
All right.
So there was an enormous learning curve where actually like a significant percentage of them starved to death. Thanksgiving should be called "Thank God Only Half of Us Starved to Death." But so in 1776, you now have a period where they have adapted their old ways to American products.
Sure.
So away from, at this point where we've moved away from beef, for example, it's a very, very pork-centered and salt pork-centered diet. Pork, beans, and corn.
Doesn't sound very healthy.
You know, most of diets throughout human history weren't very healthy. Except, you could argue that indigenous peoples had a pretty varied and healthy diet. Most cultures throughout the history of the world subsided on a small number of grains, and it wasn't tremendously healthy. Also, we don't know how much, there's only so much pork you may have had with your beans, for example, right? A little goes a long way. But the period of the Revolution is a period where we are right before the Revolution. There's already a lot of tension between the non-United States, the colonies, and Great Britain. Particularly, a lot of the staples, like the primary sweetener is molasses. And all the molasses is coming out of British colonies in the Caribbean. which are local, but there's an enormous tax. And this is a huge problem because it is pretty much the only sweetener. Sugarcane's not grown here yet. So everything from Boston baked beans, Boston brown bread, these are all molasses-sweetened foods. And suddenly this is becoming very expensive. The same, more than anything, tea is becoming heavily taxed, extremely expensive. And actually the tea that their colonists are getting is actually low quality compared to British tea. So they're paying more for a worse product. The indigenous peoples actually had a pretty sophisticated form of agriculture based on what was called the Three Sisters. And this is corn, beans, and squash. And they had a very efficient way of growing all three simultaneously, where the corn stalk would actually become the scaffolding for the peas to grow on, whereas the squash, which was grown in the same plot of land, acts as a ground cover and also prevents weeds. One of the first problems when colonists first adopted this practice, which is really quite efficient and sophisticated, they immediately reverted to English methods of cultivation, where they would plant everything in rows, they would try to clear the ground, which is actually not a good way to do it in America, particularly in the Northeast, where the first colonies were, because the soils there are actually kind of rocky and not great compared to the richer soils in a lot of the agricultural parts of England, which is why you have a corn crop instead of a wheat crop.
So what ingredients truly built the foundation of American cuisine? We're going to say corn, squash,
beans, and beans are incredibly...
And what kind of beans?
There's a number of beans, things like kidney beans, things like, peas, and fresh beans that you can then dry. The huge advantage of those is beans and corn dry quite well, and you don't need to do a lot to preserve them. In fact, early American settlers basically survived by stealing buried caches of corn that the Indians had left for themselves. Corn cultivation is also, in America, we associate it with Tisquantum or Squanto, who's a really interesting character because he did teach early colonists a lot about how to grow corn. And one of the reasons he was able to do this is that he spoke English, which he did because he was basically abducted and taken to Europe for a while and managed to make his way back. So an interesting question is why he was so very polite about teaching us to make corn and not pushing us all to sea. The other main staple, as we say, is pork, particularly salted pork. And pork actually was brought here by the Spanish somewhat by accident. I think Hernán de Soto brought about 10 pigs with him. And basically that is the basis for all the pigs, including all the feral hogs we have in the United States. Pigs have a huge advantage over cows in that you can feed them almost anything. They will forage naturally.
Sure, absolutely.
And
they eat everything.
They do. It's really great. The scraps that you won't eat, you can feed directly to pigs. They grow quite rapidly. You can't get milk out of them, particularly. Theoretically you could, but they don't produce a lot. And they're not, good for like agricultural labor. Cow can pull a plow. You can't really harness a bunch of pigs to a plow, even though they're really smart animals and they could probably teach them to dance.
Okay, so we've talked about the beginning stages. When did people start eating for pleasure?
Basically, for pleasure, you would be talking about puddings, but puddings in the early sense was any kind of sweetened, often boiled dessert, a plum pudding, sweetened corn dishes.
Desserts
are, puddings are dessert. That's why, like, in Britain today, people still ask, like, what's for pudding? As opposed to, we say dessert, they say pudding. And there was a period of most of these...
But there are savory puddings, too.
Absolutely. Hasty pudding, like the corn mush, is a savory pudding. But most of the things that we would think of as a dessert, unless it was an early cake, right? And still, early cakes, until you get way past the Revolutionary period, they're not that similar to the cakes that we would think of as cakes today. They were very dense. They might be quite sweet, not as sweet as stuff today. They probably were not frosted per se. Obviously, pies and fruit pies. Pies are an absolute staple. Actually, up through the 1950s, pies are still a real staple. But they wouldn't necessarily be thought of as much of a dessert food as just as a food. The whole idea of dessert is relatively new, even in American history. And, I mean, particularly in the early part of, in the Revolutionary period, it's a pretty subsistence economy with the exception of, rich people, even though the average American at that point still has a better diet and a more diverse diet than people back in Europe.
Okay, so let's talk about the early taverns, hearth cooking, and communal dining. When did that come into the mix?
All of those things basically predate America. If we date America from 1776, taverns and hearth cooking comes prior to that and continues for a long time past it. Cooking on a hearth is incredibly interesting, actually.
Tell me.
Because it's wild. The skill set you need is wildly different from the way we think of cooking on a modern stove with a modern oven.
It probably cooks unevenly.
It's close to the way people cook, like a sophisticated grill cook, like a backyard grill cook.
Like a live fire, open fire cooking.
Yeah, and the idea that you have different zones of different temperatures within your hearth, because you basically are building a wood fire with a fair amount of wood. You let that die down, and that transmits a huge amount of retained heat to the masonry. These are big hearths, right? And the same with ovens of this period. It's not continually heated. You get it really hot, and it's really big and has a lot of thermal mass, and it stays hot for a long time.
Like Neapolitan pizzas now.
Precisely. That technology is actually very the same. You get the physical structure of the oven tremendously hot. Neapolitan pizza, you might get up to 800 or 900 degrees at peak, and then you throw it in there for 3 minutes.
If that.
This is actually the funny reason why. So with a traditional oven, because it's going to get hot and then slowly cool down, you would bake breads first, maybe then pies, and then when you're baking small stuff, like petit fours.
They were making petit fours back then?
Later, but yes.
Okay.
Or they're making them. They're not calling them petit fours, but the word petit four means small fire. It means your fire has now died down and your oven isn't as hot as it was initially. But an American hearth, so you burn all this wood, you get a lot of embers, and you would pile some to one side to make that side much hotter, and then have another side that might be a lot cooler. And then you manage that usually with distance. So you would have, what was called a trammel system, which is basically a swing arm with a series of hooks on it that you would put, say, a cauldron on, and then you would swing that out over the hot part, and you would raise it up and down with the hooks to
Have
make
you ever
it
cooked like this?
I've cooked adjacent to this. I at one point lived on a farm and we built a masonry oven. So I have done the adjacent stuff. And a good friend of mine actually used to work at the 17th best restaurant in the world at the time, which is in Spain, but doesn't matter. They wouldn't say Spain, it's in Catalonia or something, where they do everything on these very sophisticated grills that you can move up and down, which is actually exactly the same kind of like ancient technique where you're doing everything with distance as opposed to turning the flame on a gas stove up or down. The two other major things you would do in hearth cooking are a Dutch oven, which everybody's very familiar with, but a Dutch oven is a really smart piece of kit because it's a cast iron chamber, basically, with a lid that allows you to put embers piled on top of the lid, as opposed to just cooking from the bottom. So it cooks from all sides, which is kind of what a modern oven does, but it does it by actually physically burning things on the top and the bottom. And the last thing, of course, is cooking on a spit. Cooking on a spit is really interesting, actually, from a technological standpoint, because originally, to cook something on a spit, you have to turn the spit. So traditionally, you had someone called a spit boy, whose job was to sit next to this
That would be
flame.
Pagano.
That would very much be me. You're not wrong about that.
So what you would do is you would sit next to the hearth with a fire going, and you would slowly turn the spit to cook the food. Of course, you're not that far from the food yourself, so the trick is doing that without cooking yourself at the same time, and it's a famously terrible job. So this was later supplanted in early America by what was like one of the early modern conveniences, which was a small dog on a treadmill in a box next to your hearth, and the dog would walk on the treadmill and turn the spit. And later they actually replaced the dog with clockwork, and that was like the greatest thing ever.
Was there already a distinction forming between regional cuisines even back then in the early years, like 1776, or not yet?
You start seeing a really big split. It's basically, you want to think of it between the northern colonies and like the Carolina colonies. The Carolinas, of course, had a very large enslaved African population, and they brought a lot of their African foodways. It was actually, that's why a lot of food culture in the South is actually very influenced by African culture. The single most important thing that they brought was actually rice cultivation. Because rice cultivation is really weird and tricky. And it's like, if you've never done it before, you are not going to be able to grow rice. But it's the common grain in that part of Africa. So that's why the South is associated with the rice culture. Also, it has a much better climate for it. The North is not really a great place to grow rice.
How did immigration begin shaping American food almost immediately after the country's founding?
The first great culinary innovation that I associate with immigration is actually with the waves of German immigration.
Okay.
And the major thing that they brought, along with like a very sophisticated sausage culture and sauerkraut, what they brought was beer. And of course, we had beer, but we had English-style ales. Beer was the beverage of choice for a very good reason.
What year are we in when we talk about this? Or like what decade?
We're talking about like the middle part of the 18th century. So these waves of German immigration, often fleeing from like political unrest on the continent.
Yeah.
But they really changed what we call beer in America. Prior to that, beers were English-style ales. They're much, much heavier, particularly of the porters and the stouts of the world, which I may like. But if you think of what the major American beers are, right? Budweiser, Anheuser-Busch. These are German names and German companies. And it was a different style. It was a much...
Heineken.
Actually,
that's Amsterdam.
Yeah,
that's Amsterdam.
Yeah, that actually comes out of Europe. But that's still, that style of beer, this lighter, easier to drink, often less alcoholic, is incredibly important. Also because one of the reasons beer is so widely consumed in the early part of American history and late European history is that the fermentation process of making beer kills a lot of pathogens in water. Water, particularly in a city, might be really, really unsafe to drink.
Sure, still is.
Whereas New York has amazingly good water quality.
It does.
Actually.
It's fine.
But no, beer, because of the process of fermentation, kills a lot of that and renders it drinkable.
Okay, we got to take a break, Jay. My head's spinning here with all this history. When we come back, we fast forward through industrialization, immigration, diners, drive-ins, prohibition, and post-war abundance, because America's food story is really the story of reinvention. You're listening to Culinary Confidential with Christina Cates on AM 970 The Answer.
Over the last 30 years, Newman Ferrara, a New York City law firm, has evolved into a national practice focused on real estate, commercial, litigation, civil rights, class actions, and other complex litigation, representing many of the city's largest property owners, managing agents, and thousands of tenants. Newman Ferrara handles some of the nation's most significant class actions and civil rights matters. Newman Ferrara at 55 East 59th Street, New York City. Go online to NewmanFerrara.com. That's NewmanFerrara.com. Listen to the firm's name partner, Lucas Ferrara, every Saturday at 10 a.m. on Dottie Herman's longest-running real estate radio program, Eye on Real Estate on AM 970. A real estate lawyer for 35 years, Lucas is a professor at New York Law School and is also a published author with books on real estate and New York's landlord-tenant law. Tune in Saturdays at 10 a.m. to hear Lucas's unique perspective and advice on Eye on Real Estate.
Welcome back to Culinary Confidential with Christina Cates on AM 970, The Answer.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Christina Cates, and tonight we're continuing our Americana series celebrating America's 250th anniversary through the lens of food, beverage, hospitality, and culture. Joining me again tonight is culinary historian Jay Reifel. And in this next segment, we're moving into one of the most transformative periods in American food history, 1900 to 2000, a century defined by immigration, industrialization, reinvention, and the evolution of the American dream on a plate. Because when you really think about it, the story of American food is the story of people arriving here from all over the world carrying recipes, traditions, techniques, survival instincts, and cultural identity with them. This was the era that shaped diners, delis, red sauce, Italian restaurants, Jewish bakeries, Chinese takeout culture, steakhouses, fast food chains, supper clubs, television dinners, suburban entertaining, cocktail culture, and eventually celebrity chefs and modern dining as we know it. Food became inspiration, aspiration, business, and identity. And in many ways, the American restaurant industry became one of the greatest examples of reinvention and entrepreneurship this country has ever seen. So, Jay, welcome back to the show. I'm excited for this conversation because this period really feels like the moment America became the culinary melting pot the world now recognizes.
Absolutely.
Okay, before we jump into it, I did have one last question from the last segment that we didn't get to. I had heard that Boston baked beans have religious roots. Is that true? Is that a myth?
That's a really great question, and it's actually true, this one. And this goes back really to the very early part of American history where we're talking about Puritans and some very, very religious settlers. And
Super
extremely
religious.
And the funny thing is that although we generally associate prohibitions of cooking on the Sabbath with Jewish culture, extreme early Christian sects also had the same prohibition. Basically, it was the Sabbath was on a different day, Sunday, but you were supposed to spend that day in church or in contemplative prayer.
Yeah.
So you weren't supposed to cook, for example. So what you would do is you would basically take a pot of beans and some salt pork and some molasses, and you would
set it and forget it?
Precisely.
Like a old school crock pot?
Precisely.
On the hearth?
You would bury it in the last embers on your hearth and just leave it for the next day. And it was enough retained heat that overnight it would cook and still be warm the same day. Weirdly enough, I have a very similar recipe that's a Jewish recipe from 13th century Spain in my first cookbook.
Holy moly.
Which
cookbook? The History of the World in 10 Dinners?
That's the one. There is from 13th century Muslim Spain, there is a Jewish recipe that uses precisely the same technique, and it's just to avoid cooking on the Sabbath.
Wow. Okay, I think we should talk Ellis Island and some more immigrant food influence. I know we touched a little bit on immigration in the last segment, but there was that whole second wave.
Oh, yeah, it's crazy. So the other major food, like American food is just this amalgam of immigrant foods. But the very specific ones, the ones we think of the most, are Chinese food, Italian food, I would say Jewish delis.
Yeah.
These are institutions. And one of the things that all these cultures had in common is when they were first coming, they were looked down upon and they were reasonably insular. The Chinese were basically in California and in New York. And most American Chinese food is actually specific regional cuisine.
Same like Italian American food, though.
Absolutely.
They don't eat chicken parm there.
They do not. I would say also Italian American food, like the iconic dish, apart from pizza, which is kind of a side, it's such its own thing. But when, particularly when I was younger, what you would think of as spaghetti and meatballs. And you do, of course, get meatballs in Italy, but they tend to be small and they tend to be in soup.
Yeah.
We also remember that Italian-American food is basically food of the poor people, largely from the southern part of Italy, because those were the people who were immigrating to America.
Right.
So you don't get richer people from the north, but you get food from a specific region, which is the same in Chinese food. Most of the Chinese American-style Chinese food comes from an area called the Pearl River Valley, and a lot of the immigrants were coming from Guangzhou, but the area at the time was called Canton, by Westerners, not by them, which is why classical American Chinese food is Cantonese food, because it's from the area of Canton. Obviously, it's a kind of simplified and dumbed-down version of that, because China...
So it's easily to mass produce also.
Right. Chinese food actually has, in America, has a huge advantage in that traditional Western-style food of the early periods was cooked in large batches very, very slowly and inefficiently. It was not really good for a quick meal. So a lot of places, particularly in California, around the time of the gold rush and the railroad construction, having a food culture that was more centered on making a good, quick food that was delicious relatively fast in a wok was kind of new and exciting.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about Prohibition, because that was a fascinating era. I have Noah Rothbaum coming back on the show at the end of this month to really do a full segment about it. But, Prohibition and cocktail culture deserves a moment. I mean, the whole cocktail was born in America.
Pretty much. Cocktails are one of my favorite things. And actually, a funny thing is...
Well, Dale DeGroff, right? Dale DeGroff brought us the modern cocktail. We've had him on the show.
Oh, amazing. Cocktails, in America, the first Bartender's Guide, which is the Bon Vivant's Companion, which I think is 1840s, is American. And it's already pretty sophisticated. But the various complex cocktails and that kind of cocktail culture really, really blossomed in America. And in a strange way, the biggest side effect of Prohibition in America is it spread cocktails to the rest of the world, because all the good bartenders basically left America and went to the Savoy in London. Because you couldn't do it here. Also, from a social standpoint, Prohibition is really interesting because it meant that the primary place where you would drink was a speakeasy, which was illegal, which often had entertainment, but also it was less segregated, particularly between the sexes. A lot more liberated women would go drink in a speakeasy where they would not have been traditionally allowed to drink in a bar prior to that. A very absolutely male-dominated environment.
Okay, what is the relationship to Army food in World War II and post-war food?
Literally everything.
Okay.
So literally every innovation that we associate with food culture today came out of the U.S. Army during World War II. Obviously, military food always represents an incredible challenge. This was a moment of incredible American industrial application. And there was a huge amount of just research in everything. So literally, if you go into a convenience store, if you go into a supermarket and walk down the aisle, anything in a plastic package, anything with food additives, anything with food colorants, every ingredient on the back of that box was developed and tested by the United States Army, mostly during World War II.
Wow.
It is so far-reaching. And after, they continued, up through Vietnam. They were still always refining. And they actually shared a lot of these industrial patents. They didn't make money on it. They actually allow those to be used in general by major corporations. Even the industrial processes that you make processed food and you make individual portions and you package them in a certain way, all these things was developed by the United States Army. It's actually kind of crazy.
Yeah, but isn't it crazy though how we feed the Army all of these packaged processed foods and we're like, here, eat this, and then have energy and defend our country? Thank God we have Robert Irvine coming on next week, who really revamped the program, right?
Absolutely. But in a world war, it is much more important to deliver calories to the battle space in a way that, is not going to make anybody sick. The fact that disease was usually the major killer of soldiers throughout most wars, and that was often related to food. This was a problem that was hugely solved by the United States military. And just even the simple stuff of, yes, it's really disgusting. Powdered eggs, really disgusting. Powdered milk, pretty bad, actually.
And coffee, it's palatable.
Yeah, but it's light. And if you're moving around a lot of milk and eggs,
Yeah.
removing all the water from them is an incredibly efficient strategy.
If you had to pick one decade that completely transformed American cuisine forever, which would it be?
I wouldn't say a specific decade, but it's the onset of refrigeration. So basically, the combination of the onset of refrigeration with meat packing technologies, because prior to that, meat was pretty seasonable and it didn't travel well unless the weather was very, very cold. So the invention of refrigerated rail cars.
Okay, when was that?
So you're really talking about the late 1860s, early 1870s when it really changed. Men like Gustavus Smith and Armour, which is still the brand of a lot of meats today, Armour brand, are people who actually pioneered the invention and use of this refrigerated rail technology, which allows you, first of all, to farm massive amounts of cattle, say, out west, and run them to, say, Chicago on a rail network, slaughter them there, and then run them everywhere else, as opposed to trying to slaughter your own cow or going to the local guy. So it makes beef protein tremendously cheaper.
Okay, Jay, this has been such a fascinating conversation because you really start to realize that the American dream has so often been built inside kitchens, bakeries, diners, delis, bars, and family restaurants passed down through the generations. From immigration and industrialization to the rise of restaurant culture and modern hospitality, food truly became one of the greatest reflections of who America was becoming throughout the 20th century. When we come back, we're taking this conversation into the future. We'll talk about where American food culture is headed next, what defines modern Americana in 2026, the rise of food media and celebrity chefs, how globalization changed the American palate, and whether we're preserving or losing some of the traditions that built this country's culinary identity in the first place. So stay with us. More with culinary historian Jay Reifel after the break.
Over the last 30 years, Newman Ferrara, a New York City law firm, has evolved into a national practice focused on real estate, commercial, litigation, civil rights, class actions, and other complex litigation, representing many of the city's largest property owners, managing agents, and thousands of tenants. Newman Ferrara handles some of the nation's most significant class actions and civil rights matters. Newman Ferrara at 55 East 59th Street, New York City. Go online to newmanferrara.com. That's newmanferrara.com. Listen to the firm's name partner, Lucas Ferrara, every Saturday at 10 a.m. on Dottie Herman's longest-running real estate radio program, Eye on Real Estate on AM 970. A real estate lawyer for 35 years, Lucas is a professor at New York Law School and is also a published author with books on real estate and New York's landlord-tenant law. Tune in Saturdays at 10 a.m. to hear Lucas's unique perspective and advice on Eye on Real Estate.
Welcome back to Culinary Confidential with Christina Cates on AM 970. The Answer.
Welcome back to the show. Tonight we're building a culinary time capsule from 1776 to 2026 with food historian Jay Reifel. And now we move into the era where America didn't just eat food, it began defining global food culture. Welcome back to the show, Jay.
Thanks so much.
I love it. Okay, in 2026, does American cuisine even have a single definition anymore?
Maybe no. I mean, you know, there's things we call new American cuisine, but I would say the thing that makes American food culture truly great is, and maybe this is what defines, we have the most diverse food culture in the world. I live in Queens in New York, and Queens literally has it is the space with the most diverse food culture on the planet. More languages are spoken.
Heard that.
More languages are spoken in Queens than anywhere. More different kind of cuisines you can get, and the number of incredible food you can get is just it's unbelievable. So I would say that's what really defines modern American food culture.
I love it. You know what I thought of over the last break? When was like the first American cookbook?
Oh, the first truly American cookbook is from 1796, written by a woman named Amelia Simmons. And prior to that, there were cookbooks that were published in America. They are almost indistinguishable from English cookbooks of the same period. In fact, some of them are clearly just cribbed, like they're just copied. That cookbook is really distinctive for a couple reasons. It is the first one that includes recipes with corn, and it's the first pumpkin pie recipe. Ooh. So these are indigenous American ingredients that weren't at that point eaten in Europe or England. It's also and intentionally, like, it's a downscale cookbook. Amelia Simmons, like, famously described herself as an orphan, and she was designing a cookbook for middle class, lower middle class. Those classes don't really track historically the way they might, but it was very deliberately not an upscale cookbook. So that's really what defines it as the first truly American.
What's the greatest or like most important restaurant in American history?
Oh, that's easy. That's Delmonico's.
It's right downtown. We had Max Tucci on the show.
Exactly.
Love Max Tucci.
And the funny thing about Delmonico's, now we think of Delmonico's as a restaurant, whereas Delmonico's at its height was a mini empire. There were 7, I believe, different branches across New York. But it defined high-end cuisine.
Fine dining.
For a century, basically. It was incredibly innovative. It was the first American restaurant to have an a la carte menu, really, right? Of course, that menu was in French, and it was serving French food. In fact, I mean, interesting thing is I don't think the White House stopped printing menus in French until I think Carter.
Wow.
It's crazy.
I mean, you really do know it all, Jay.
But even when I was a kid, the fancy restaurants had menus like in English and French. And it was just like, it was de rigueur, as you might say. But I think the most interesting thing to me of food of that period is that in the 19th century, like if you look at Delmonico's cookbook, which is one of my favorites, my second favorite cookbook in the history of the world, and it's an absolute monstrous, like 2,000-page, heavily illustrated tome, the test piece for a chef were cold dishes. These really elaborate architectural cold dishes, which I'm not going to bore you with an incredibly long description of because I've done it a million times. But that's what people, we thought these things that looked like super fancy French pastry but had a stuffed bird inside.
Right.
Whereas now you would never get served anything like that.
You wouldn't eat that. All right, we got to jump, I think, a little bit modern day, present day, right? 2026. What is the effect of food media or social influencers, right? Like those food influencers you see in restaurants on food today?
It's huge. And I think it's both good and bad,
Tell me why on both sides.
Well, I think...
Because I'll tell you what, I am not a food influencer by any stretch. I get paid to do nothing. But I do find myself, and my friends will like make fun of me. They're like, the phone eats before we do when Christina's at the table. I gotta take pictures of it all.
That I think is kind of charming and wonderful. Like I am not one of those people who think it's like so terrible or weird to post pictures of what you're eating.
But I don't put the flash on in the restaurant.
Good.
I am, considerate to the other diners.
Excellent. I think the problem is that because so much of food medium is coming through, Instagram or TikTok, say, the food might be beautiful and it might be interesting, but you actually have no sense of whether it's good, and you have no sense of whether a recipe is actually works, right?
Yeah.
There are so many people who might be particularly charming, and they might be or particularly attractive, and people want to emulate their lifestyle. That doesn't necessarily mean that person can teach you how to cook better. They might be able to, they might not. So it is media, and to me, it's marvelous that so many people are excited about food now.
Because everyone's a foodie, right?
That's tremendous to me. But it doesn't necessarily translate to quality. And the same food media, and full disclosure, I have participated in and won on absurd cooking shows. But competitive cooking is it's pretty silly. I mean, also, it engenders this idea that speed and pressure is the test of a chef.
That's a great point.
And as someone who's worked in fine dining, it's actually completely backwards, because that world is work incredibly long hours, do everything meticulously, and kill yourself. But it's not necessarily time pressure isn't necessarily the issue there.
What do you think are the biggest issues in sustainable food today?
Unquestionably animal protein. And I love animal protein. Full disclosure, I am not a vegan, I'm not a vegetarian. I like animal protein. I eat it somewhat sparingly, and I appreciate it when I eat it. But turning physical resources into animal protein is just incredibly inefficient. The amount of water you need to build a cow, to build a steak is kind of insane, even if you don't count the water you needed to raise the fodder for the animal. There are, obviously there was a real revolution in artificial plant-based products, which are actually surprisingly good, although they're really expensive. Like a nice, really high-end meat substitute might cost the same as tenderloin. And now people...
Like, not a lab-grown meat.
Not yet, no. Lab-grown meat is a thing and actually has been accepted for human consumption.
Not on this show.
But it's still wildly, wildly expensive right now. And the technology, probably, like everything else, will probably improve. So that's probably a better way to do it, and we will see. The other...
All right, you be the guinea pig, Jay.
I'm totally... Hey, look, I've eaten so many bugs. I'm fine with eating some lab-grown meat.
That's probably the least offensive thing on your plate.
I've eaten way weirder things than lab-grown meat. I mean, the other big sustainability issue is just food waste. Americans waste something like 30 to 40% of all food that we make, whether it's because of expiration dates or just the fact that people would much prefer to eat a pretty vegetable than a tasty one, and they don't want to eat a twisted or ugly one. So there's huge amounts of product that just gets thrown away.
Okay, if somebody opens a Culinary Time Capsule in, say, 2126, what would you think they would find in there? Where's the future going in the industry? I think it's going to be all artificial everything. Lab-grown apples.
Oh, you mean what they're going to have in 100 years? I think of a time capsule of now to then.
Like if we planted something now.
Yeah, I am sure in 100 years there's going to be a significant amount of lab-grown proteins. I frankly think probably there'll be much more of like vertical and like hydroponic farms. There's already some really
That's
great...
fine.
Yeah, there's some really
like that.
great... If you think about the fact that one of the most inefficient things in food production today is transportation, right? Food, particularly foods with high water content, are physically heavy and they're perishable. So a really efficient solution is to efficiently grow produce locally. And that technology is just in the last 10 years has come enormously. So if we're talking about 100 years from now, I suspect that will have developed enormously.
I bet you could put a Breyers ice cream sandwich in a time capsule and open it in 100 years and it will still be intact the exact same way.
Yep.
Because it's not made with real ingredients.
I mean, really, you could say the same about a McDonald's hamburger. You
Absolutely.
put that in there, it'll still be intact in 100 years, and it'll probably still be edible. Why?
Yes.
Who knows? But that's just the way it is now.
You know what we didn't talk about, but we're kind of out of time? AI. How AI is affecting the industry right now.
At least in the food industry right now, the effects are a little bit overblown. It really hasn't made a dent, certainly not in the restaurant world. I would say what AI probably does better than anything right now is it allows the average person to look in their fridge and say, this is what I have. Give me a recipe that I can make it for that.
Absolutely.
I would argue, though, that this is my problem with AI in general. That thing that it's doing for you is one of the little joys of life. Like looking in your fridge and thinking, what can I make with this? That's what cooking is. Like that's
being inventive.
That's a marvelous skill. That's fun. So
but it's not fun for someone who can't cook.
It's true, but like the recipe that the AI gives isn't necessarily going to teach you how to cook it.
That's true.
You still have to know how to cook a bit. I'm just saying, those are the things. That's one of the pleasures of cooking. So if you don't like cooking, which is fine, then just order in. Don't ask AI what to do with that stuff in your fridge. Just order some food. Food's great. But yeah, don't offload creativity to a machine when you could do it yourself. And I can teach you how.
America's story has always been told through its tables, through immigrants, innovation, struggle, abundance, tradition, and reinvention. And maybe the most fascinating part is that the story is still being written every single day. Thank you for listening to Culinary Confidential, Sunday nights at 9 p.m. on AM 970 The Answer. As we close out tonight's episode of the show, I hope this conversation reminded you that food is so much more than what's on the plate. It's history, identity, resilience, immigration, innovation, celebration, and memory. America's story has always been told called Around the Table, and tonight was just the beginning of our Americana series celebrating the 250th anniversary of this incredible nation. A huge thank you to culinary historian Jay Reifel for taking us on this journey through America's culinary time capsule from 1776 to 2026. I think we'll have you back next year too, Jay, right? Season
Absolutely.
3 times in a row.
Thank you so much for having me. Such a pleasure.
Next Sunday, the Americana series continues with a truly powerful conversation as I'm joined by Chef Robert Irvine, world-renowned chef, entrepreneur, television personality, and founder of the Robert Irvine Foundation, which supports veterans, active duty military, first responders, and their families through food, wellness, and community initiatives. We'll talk leadership, service, the state of hospitality in America, and the very real issue of food insecurity among military families, all through the lens of one of the most recognizable and impactful figures in modern food culture. It's a conversation you absolutely do not want to miss. Until then, continue supporting hospitality, continue gathering around the table, and continue appreciating the stories behind the food that connects us all. I'm Christina Cates, and this has been Culinary Confidential. Have a good night.
The preceding program is sponsored by Shake It Off Live, LLC.
In a world that screams for your attention, there is a place that invites you to peace. You don't need a building. You don't need a choir. You just need to turn your heart to Air One.
Air One, songs that heal, lyrics that pray for you when you don't have the words.
From Lauren Daigle to Elevation Worship and more.
This isn't just radio. It's worship for the everyday.
Escape the noise and worship now.
Download the Air One app. Ask your smart speaker to play Air One or visit air1.com. Air One, worship now.